and we are now going. So if we go and have a look at some of the concepts that we've talked about before, and what I want to do first is really think through some of the material that we've already covered. What I really want to do is think through what it is that we are, what it is that we're talking about when it comes to thinking about recovery and stress and stimulus. Because it really, these are opposite sides of the same coin, right? That when we are inducing a type of stress onto an athlete, what we're doing is giving a stimulus for that person to respond to. And we really want to have an understanding of what it is that that folks are exposed to, so that we can then think through how it is that we can respond to it. So really what we're talking about here is a model of recovery. And this is going to be the first of a 4-part series, where initially we're just going to introduce this model, some new concepts around functional state and ways to categorize the type of loads that folks are placed under. And then think also about some basic sort of strategies to be able to organize your recovery against that, right? Because what we have here is an opportunity to be able to revisit some content. The first bunch of slides that you'll see here may be familiar to you if you've been through our phase 1 performance mentorship, if you've done the Exos Performance Specialist online course. These are slides right from that regen presentation. And really what I want to do here is revisit the key concept of the recovery cycle. What is it that, how is it that we apply a stimulus and then expect a deliberate adaptation out of that stimulus? From there, we really want to diverge from content that's existed in the way that we've thought about recovery in the past and start to break ground into some new ideas and new concepts. And really what we want to do here, and this is what we're quite excited about, is introduce the concept of functional state. What the status is of your athletes, of your clients, of your members as they walk into the gym. And is that a positive or a negative in terms of their ability to perform in the session that they're meant to perform in today? Finally, using this construct of functional state, we want to think about, is there an opportunity for us to be able to organize stress loads? And we're going to talk about stress loads here in detail as we go, and offer supporting strategies, on the assumption that not all training sessions are going to affect the person in the same way. For example, a really heavy lift is not going to have the same effect in terms of stimulus and stress as a psychologically very heavy day. For example, you go and have a really heavy lifting session versus, and the way that you feel sort of stressed and beat up after that, as opposed to the way that you would feel stressed and beat up after sitting in traffic for 45 minutes. Certainly, they're not the same stimulus. Certainly, they both tax the human system, but historically, we haven't necessarily been very well equipped to be able to address these. And so when we start to get into this, we want to revisit this concept of the recovery cycle. And here, remember that this next batch of slides, these are pulled straight from our regen lecture, from our phase 1 performance mentorship, or the Exos Performance Specialist course. So some of this may be familiar to you. If not, I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce and address this concept here, because fundamentally, what we understand is that it's not just training that gets athletes, that gets clients, that gets members better. It's more than training. It's got to be the balance of both training and recovery, the balance of work and rest. And indeed, we understand that it's not just work, but rather it's work plus rest that ultimately ends up resulting in success. And this balance of work and rest is something that we've got to have built into our training plans. This slide, I love this slide because this is a blueprint to the original Athletes Performance Exos facility on the campus of Arizona State University, where we were from 1999 until 2009. And when this building was designed with and laid out, it was laid out and designed with the specific intent of having the delineation between work and rest built into the structure of the building, fundamentally and literally built into the foundation of the place where athletes, where clients, where members came to do the work that they needed to do. Because what we understand is that it's not just work that makes athletes better. It's the balance of work and rest, right? If you go and you train and you just train and train and train, eventually you're just going to end up digging yourself a hole that you're not able to get out of. And so what we have to consider is that stress accumulates within the body in a very similar way to that an injury may, right? And just like recovering from an injury, we need to have opportunity to heal. We need to have opportunity, to use different language, to recover from that injury. And in the same way, in training, we have to have opportunity to respond to the stress, to the stimulus that we apply. So it's not just work plus work that equals success, because that results in you coming into overtraining syndrome or non-functional overreaching. And it's also not rest plus rest that equals success, because if it were, I would be the best athlete on the planet, especially after the last year and a half that we've had. It's the balance of work and rest. And so the ultimate question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is that balance? How do we find that appropriate give and take between stimulus and response? Fundamentally, we understand how important this is. And to give a bit of an example, if you were to go outside and rub your hand on the floor, on the asphalt in the parking lot for 5 hours, what would your hands look like? It'd probably look a bit like ground beef. But if you were to go and do that same thing, break up that same time and stretch that out over the course of a year, 5 minutes per day, 7 days a week, over the course of a year, would you respond in the same way? And in that case, you would have a much more appropriate response or positive adaptation. We would have an adaptation that that would end up being helpful as opposed to being detrimental. And the thing that I love about this, the thing that's so good about this, is that it's exactly the same stimulus. You're rubbing your hand on the asphalt. And in one case where you have a huge block of exposure to that, it actually breaks you down and ends up digging a hole that you're not able to readily get out of. Whereas when you break that same exact stimulus up and pair it with an appropriate amount of rest, in this case, rest being opportunity to be able to respond to the stimulus which was applied, by going 5 minutes a day, 7 days a week over the course of a year, now we get the positive adaptation that we're after. Fundamentally, we've understood this for quite some time as the recovery cycle, that it's not just work, it's not work plus work, and it's also not rest plus rest, but rather it is the balance of work and rest that results in the adaptation or the success, as we've called it before. And so ultimately, this is the thing that we're after. And that's why the recovery is one of the pillars of the Exos training system, right? Because it's not just about the movement that you do. It's not just about your ability to withstand training. It's about your ability to respond to training. And so we have to consider this balance of work and rest. And even within this work and rest period, we can think about the elements and the ways in which you respond, the things that we can do to encourage the recovery process. Historically, we've called this regeneration. And regeneration, you'll remember, are activities or strategies which are designed to help facilitate the recovery process. This is a dedicated and planned training component or day where regeneration strategies are implemented. Regeneration is a bunch of tools that you have in a tool belt to be able to facilitate the recovery process. This isn't stuff that you would do to get stronger, to get fitter, to get faster, to get more flexible, whatever it is, but rather this is stuff that you would do to allow your athletes the opportunity to be able to drive up out of that hole, to come into super compensation so that we are able to ride the wave of positive adaptation. Regeneration are things that we specifically do to facilitate this recovery process, understanding within that a lot of it is muscle protein synthesis. You've been through an incredibly catabolic process, muscle protein breakdown, through some type of training session. And so now what we need to do is heal from that injury of muscle protein breakdown, respond or recover from that stimulus. We need to adapt. So we need to have time to adapt so that we then are able to facilitate you coming out of that hole, riding that wave of supercompensation, so that ultimately over time we can induce a positive training adaptation. When we look specifically at regeneration, then we understand that there are different categories of skills and strategies that we can employ, that we have at our disposal. Because here we think about regeneration or recovery as the process of athletes overcoming the stresses of the training or the tactical environment, right? And these are again things that we're going to do specifically to facilitate that process. And generally, historically, what we've done is we've organized these into active categories and an active category or a passive category of strategies that we can employ, where we think about each of these things as different types of activities or strategies that we can use to help athletes come out. And when we think about the passive strategies, these are really rest, right? Rest meaning downtime. And so we call these passive strategies, or we have called these passive strategies in the past, because they are things that you will do within a 24-hour cycle, whether or not you were specifically doing them with the intent of facilitating the recovery process. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't do some things to optimize the way that you sleep, to optimize your nutrition, to optimize your psychological unload through some type of meditative practice, some type of breathing practice, these sorts of things. It doesn't mean that we can't go out of our way to improve sleep hygiene, to improve these things, specifically with the intent of facilitating the recovery process. Remember that we just call these passive because in any 24-hour cycle, you're going to be sleeping. You're probably going to be eating, and you're likely going to be breathing as well. And so considering that these are things which are sort of fundamental to the human experience, we would call these passive because they're things more or less that can happen in the background. Whereas when we think about the active strategies are things that we do specifically to facilitate the recovery process. These are not things that you would do within the 24-hour cycle if you weren't looking at recovery, looking at stimulating a bit of regeneration from a training stimulus. And we've talked historically about self-massage or some soft tissue type work. We've talked about stretching, different types of stretching, active versus passive. We've talked about hydrotherapy, cold tub, and contrast of a hot and a cold, of hot and cold tub contrast exposure. And we talked about active rest, right? Which is this yellow zone type work. And so we have this construct here of active and passive strategies, which we can employ to best effect to be able to facilitate the recovery process. And what I want to do now is sort of think through the way that these are organized, because historically we haven't really had a whole lot of rhyme or reason. Right? Historically, we would go and throw some active strategies together. We would give some tips on some passive recovery strategies. Here are things that you can do to improve your sleep. Make sure the room is dark. Make sure the room is quiet. Make sure the room is cold. Right? Here are some things that we can do to optimize nutrition, of getting your omega-3 fatty acids, of specifically targeting things which are going to be anti-inflammatory as opposed to pro-inflammatory. But we haven't really ever had the ability to be able to periodize and to organize these things. And so the question is, how do we know when to do what? When should we soft tissue versus when should we stretch? When should we focus on meditation and breath work versus when should we focus on nutrition, right? Because you think, you think about your day-to-day experience. How many thousands of different types of stress are there, right? You think about all of the different things which induce a response from the human system from you. Remember that Dr. Hans Selye, who first described stress in the 1920s and 1930s defined it as the syndrome which consists of all changes within a biologic system. All changes, be they positive or negative. And like we saw before in the previous example of going and rubbing your hand against the asphalt for a block of 5 hours, that can be a negative, that can induce a negative response versus taking exactly that same stimulus and breaking that up into a more appropriate relationship of work and rest, or exposure and adaptation. Taking exactly that same stimulus and breaking that up into a much more cohesive and appropriate exposure can end up putting that stimulus in a situation where it ends up inducing a positive training reaction, a positive adaptation of developing the type of callus that you would expect to develop so that you then are able to continue to expose to that. But you think of all of the different things that there are that can stress you, right? Even just think about the ways that you can feel stressed just getting to work in the morning, right? You were up late last night, because you were watching the show and you just had to see the new episode of Ted Lasso, because you really just do, right? And so you went to bed a little bit late, and then the kids were up last night because one of them got sick, right? And then your alarm didn't go off, and so you're stressed about that because you woke up late, and then you spilled the coffee on the way running out to the car because you had all this stuff going on, and just for you to go and sit in traffic and get cut off on the freeway going to get to your exit, and then you run a red light because you're trying to make up some time and catch yourself on a speeding or get yourself a ticket from a camera. All of these different things are going to end up accumulating on the system, on the human system. And that could just be on your way into work. That could just be on your way into the gym. All of these situational, environmental, maybe psychological stressors can accumulate before you've even had the opportunity to apply any sort of training stimulus at all. And so all of these different things are bombarding us 24 hours a day, right? Especially if you have your phone next to your bed, especially if you have poor sleep hygiene, you are constantly being bombarded with stressors that demand response from the body. And Dr. Selye described the process by which we are able to respond to this as the general adaptation syndrome. Where in general adaptation syndrome, initially, in the way that he described it, there is a stimulus, right? There's a thing that the body has to respond to, that we have to respond to. After that stimulus, once that stimulus is applied, then there is a response, right? Sympathetic nervous system gets activated, blood gets redistributed, all of the sympathetic things happen. Your pupils dilate, your blood pressure changes, you shunt blood away from the gut and into the working muscles. You secrete more cortisol to be more catabolic so that you can break down fuel, so there's fuel availability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get into this response phase where you then are able to respond appropriately to that stimulus. But what Dr. Selye went on to describe is an exhaustion phase, where considering that stimulus is applied consistently, eventually there's fatigue, eventually there's exhaustion that develops. And so when we are constantly bombarded with these stressors, psychological, emotional, interpersonal, how I interact with folks around me, intrapersonal, how I deal with myself, right? When we're looking at all of these different things, it's easy for us to be in a constant response phase. And when we are in a constant response phase, we ultimately will end up resulting in exhaustion. We ultimately will end up resulting in burnout, right? We ultimately will end up resulting in overtraining syndrome, in non-contact overuse injury. If we don't have a system to be able to organize the way that this work, that these stressors are exposed to us, then we don't have a system, we don't have opportunity to be able to respond. But if you think about all these different types of stressors, do they show up in the same way in the body? Right? Is that psychological stress that you feel getting into the gym because you were late because of Ted Lasso? Is that going to show up in the human body, in the human system, the same way that a training session would? Right? Are you going to respond from a psychological stressor to the same way that you may respond to a more mechanical type stressor, right? And so historically, we've had this grab bag of tricks: soft tissue, active rest, mobility work, either active or passive, etc. And we've sort of just had a bit of a shotgun approach. But the question that we need to ask ourselves, especially in 2021, when it becomes so easy for us to collect readiness data on folks, athletes are certainly used to it, but the general population is much more accustomed to it as well, is that appropriate? Is that shotgun approach to recovery, that cast a wide net approach to recovery, is that really the best thing that we can do? Or can we be a bit more targeted? Can we be a bit more deliberate with the way that we are thinking about programming our recovery, so that we then are able to go and maximize our ability to respond to the environment, our ability to respond to the stress that's placed upon us. And this is where this concept of functional state comes in, because functional state is really an update for us in methodology. Functional state for us is really based on our understanding of people and the way that people work. Imagine, if you will, one athlete, right? Imagine the same athlete goes through 3 training sessions, right? Session 1, high speed, big jumps, heavy lifts, right? Thinking about like maybe it's 5 working sets of 2 reps and 93% of 1 rep max. Think about full speed sprints. Think about big depth jumps for height onto a tall box. These types of very big, heavy, very short, but very high load stimuli, right? Consider that as session 1. Session 2, think about moderate to high intensity work with low to moderate rest. More of a mechanical type hypertrophy training session if you've been through some of our other content as well. Thinking about maybe it's 6 working sets of 6 reps at 82% of 1 rep max. Maybe it is shorter repeated hill sprints. Maybe you're out for a trail run and you're running downhill, right? And eccentrically loading with every stride and every step, right? So session 1, high speed, big jumps, heavy lifts. Session 2, more of a mechanical type stimulus where it is just a grind to get through the session. Session 3, think about a lower intensity, longer duration type session, right? 3 working sets of 12 reps at 60% of 1 rep max. Think about more classic sort of cardiovascular type training sessions. Think about more metabolic conditioning type training sessions. These sorts of things which have a bit of a lower intensity, but a significantly longer duration, right? And we think about these 3 sessions: high intensity, low volume; moderate intensity, moderate volume; low intensity, high volume in the gym, right? Are these the same? Think about how you feel after session 1. Think about how that one athlete will feel after session 1. High speed, big jumps, heavy lifts. How are they going to feel the rest of the day? Right? Maybe they'll be in a bit of a fog, right? They'll have what I call in the powerlifting community the squat flu, where you just got a bit of a fog coming over your head. You don't really feel like you're able to get up and do a whole lot. All you want to do is eat everything that you can see and go to sleep. Versus session 2, that moderate intensity work with moderate volume. Again, 6x6 at 82% of 1 rep max, for example. How do you feel the rest of the day or the day after? You probably feel really, really sore, right? Well, is that the same to that really big, heavy, fast training session, right? And what about that third option of that more metabolic type training session, metabolic conditioning, right? Your cardiovascular training. How do you feel the rest of the day or the day after there, right? Maybe you have, maybe the day after that, your legs burn just thinking about going up a set of stairs, right? And so here we have to consider if these are the same stimuli. Because if we agree that these will affect the athlete for a period of time, right, we then need to have appropriate strategies to be able to respond to those, right? So these are all going to negatively impact the ability of the athlete of your patient, of your member to go and repeat that same training session within the next 24 to 48, in some cases, even up to 96 hours later, right? What can we do to facilitate a good response, right? Historically, we haven't had a good construct to understand to organize the different types of stimulus, and based on those specific types of stimuli, what the recovery strategies are or should be based on those. And so when we go and think about this, these training sessions represent an external load, right? This external load is a thing that an athlete, that a patient, that a member is doing. And it could be that heavy, fast, hard training session, right? It could be that more mechanical type training session. It could be that more metabolic type training session. And those three training sessions would be represented as what we call an external load. This is a thing that a person does. And so when we go through this external load, when we go and do these training sessions, what happens in effect is that load, that external training stimulus, gets internalized, right? It gets internalized within the human system. And this becomes really important because no two people are going to be the same. And so while the external load may be the same, okay, 5 working sets of 2 at 92% of 1 rep max, the way that you respond to that is going to be very different to the way that I respond to that because you're much stronger than me. And so the load, the tax that costs you because you are stronger than me is going to be less than what it taxes and what it costs me. The external load gets internalized based on the individual, based on what the performance capabilities of that person are, based on their ability to internalize that stress with the least amount of cost. And so the one training session, even though the external load can be identical, go run up this mountain. That's X distance at X incline in X amount of time, right? That one external stimulus, external load, that one training session can cost any number of people any number of individual amounts of stress based on the performance capabilities that they show up with on that day, what they physically are capable of. And so if you're stronger or fitter than one person or another, then that same training session will cost you less than somebody else who is in not as good a shape, not as ready to go. And so within this, of course, the external load would be the X's and O's of that training session. Again, X distance, Y incline, Z time, right? But then, of course, what happens when you're running outside, for example, is the environment. It plays a role as well, doesn't it? That sometimes here in Phoenix in July, it can be quite hot. Lately, it's been really humid, which is odd for us. We're not used to that. We're used to it being very dry. And so the environment can have a sort of multiplying effect, right? Where it can either increase the external load, it can increase the rate at which you have the thing with which you have to respond. Or on the other hand, if the weather were perfect, if it was, research has shown that for running, the optimal temperature is about 51 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I think, 11 degrees Celsius, with somewhere between 60 and 80% humidity. Say, for example, you thread that needle and you get into that sweet spot of weather, right? The environment there can be a multiplier in terms of your ability to perform in that session. And so the environment can multiply the load, the external load, either to the positive can multiply it, either making it more challenging to respond to, thereby increasing the internal load, the way that you need to respond to it, or the environment can decrease it when it's favorable, right? Thereby decreasing the internal load that gets placed upon. But when we think about how training sessions, external loads get internalized, right? We really think about organizing the way that load gets internalized into 4 categories. And really, we're thinking about stress loads, training sessions, external loads that get internalized to the neural system, as a neural stress load, right, would be affecting your nervous system. We think about it as a mechanical stress load, looking at soft tissues. We think about a metabolic stress load of some soft tissue for sure, but also primarily more the cardiovascular system. And you think about psychological stress loads. And these 4 different categories of stress loads, neural, mechanical, metabolic, and psychological, give us opportunity to be able to organize the external loads that are placed on people, give us opportunity to be able to organize the way that that external load gets internalized as stress load in the internal system, within the skin, inside the skin. And it gives us opportunity to be able to talk about functional state, where functional state is the status of the biologic systems on the given day, right? The status of your neural, mechanical, metabolic, and psychological systems. Because if these 4 categories are categories that we use to organize the internal response to external stimuli, they then also give us opportunity to be able to organize the way that we understand stress, the way that we understand recovery. Because if you come in and your nervous system is super fatigued, just yesterday, you had that big jumps, heavy lifts, and fast sprints training session, what I called training session number 1 earlier. If just yesterday you had that training system, there's going to be a significant load on your nervous system. Granted, it's also going to affect your mechanical system, isn't it? If you're going 5x2 at 92% of 1 rep max, like your soft tissue is also working, isn't it? It's just more of a demand. And by more, I mean like maybe it's a 60-40, right? Type split. It's just a bit more of a demand on the nervous system's ability to organize that action, right? Whereas if you come into session number 2, that mechanical type training session, I think it was 6x6 at 82% of 1 rep max was the example that I gave. Then in that mechanical training session, if you just did that yesterday, how are you going to feel today? Right? That is certainly going to have an impact on your nervous system's ability to organize the action. But really, that's more going to be a stimulus to the soft tissue, right? To the muscle, to the tendon, to the ligament, to these sorts of things to be able to express that work. You think then about session 3, that metabolic type training session was 3x12 at 60% of 1 rep max, more cardiovascular type training, these sorts of things. That is going to be more of a metabolic stimulus, right? And versus all that stress of coming into the gym and being late, all because of Ted Lasso. All of that is going to affect your psychological system. And so if your neural system, your mechanical system, your metabolic system, or your psychological system are down because of stimulus that was applied within the last 24 to 96 hours, then that's going to affect your functional state or the status of the biological systems that you show up with today. Because you may be able, for example, in a perfect world, right? Everything gone exactly to plan the way that you hoped it would. You might be able to jump 30 inches. I don't know what that is in centimeters, probably about 1 million. You might be able to jump. It's actually probably about 65. No, it'd be more than that. It'd be closer to a meter. You might be able to jump 30 inches. But if your nervous system is down because of training session, if your soft tissue is down because of training session, if your metabolic systems are down because of training, if your psychological systems are down because of stress, then you're not going to be able to tap into that full potential. And so functional state is how you show up on the day based on the work that you've done. And based on the work that you've done is sort of an intentionally vague statement, because we understand that certain types of stress loads are going to affect the body in different ways. For example, a neural type stress load, again, 5x2 at 92% of 1 rep max, is potentially going to affect somebody for up to 96 hours. Whereas if you go for a light jog, that might be 12 to 24 hours for you to respond all the way, for you to respond to. And understand that this is a system for us to be able to categorize the stress that folks are placed under, right? We can then name sessions as this was a more neural session, a more mechanical session, a more metabolic session versus a more psychological type session. And understands that even though we have these categories, neural, mechanical, metabolic, or psychological, doesn't mean that sessions are only going to be one. If you have that really big, heavy, fast session, yes, there's going to be a nervous system demand, but it's also going to be challenging on the soft tissue. If you have that more mechanical session, 6x6 at 82%, right? Yes, that's going to challenge soft tissues and it's going to make you sore, but it's also going to challenge your nervous system and it's also going to have a bit of a metabolic impact as well. It sort of sits in the middle, doesn't it? Your metabolic type sessions, if you're going and running up a mountain, sure, that's going to be challenging cardiovascularly, but you got to come down the other side as well. And running downhill can be a mechanical stimulus then that taxes these soft tissues of the body. And so any one session can be a combination of these things, but we can say, we then can organize, this session was more neural, this one was more mechanical, this one was more metabolic, and this one was more psychological. And so when we then have opportunity to be able to organize these things, right, we can then consider the way that they're going to impact somebody's functional state. And functional state is really an interesting topic in 2021 because we have access to it now. How many general population clients do you have that come in wearing an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a Garmin or something that is going to tell them, give them an indication of how well recovered they are? And if you go and look at, the data that these wearables are tracking, a lot of this data has to do and is based on different interpretations of heart rate. And so if you go and you do a training session, and you see some change in heart rate, what type of training session is going to affect your heart rate a whole bunch? Well, that's going to be a metabolic stimulus. A metabolic external load, a metabolic stress load is going to affect your cardiovascular system. And so if the majority of the way that we understand recovery status is based on different interpretations of heart rate, by and large, again, and know that there are other things that we're looking at in terms of activity, in terms of body temperature, in terms of some other things as well. But if the main sort of element, the main data point that we're looking at is heart rate, then doesn't that sort of skew the way that we see and understand what somebody's recovery status is? Doesn't that then bias the metabolic stress that somebody's under? For example, if you go out and you ride your bike for 5 or 6 hours, right? You go and you ride to the next town and you stop and you have a coffee and then you ride and you come back home, right? If we are targeting, if we are prioritizing, if we are biasing metabolic stimulus, what that means is that session might be rated as more challenging, a 6-hour steady state ride. Maybe some folks would call that a recovery ride, right? That session might be prioritized as more challenging over a session of 45 minutes of genuine to the wall, heart in your throat, taste vomit intervals, right? Where in the 45 minutes that you're on the bike doing those really high level intervals, you are absolutely redlined, full on to the wall, right? And if the way that we understand recovery is based in large part on different interpretations of heart rate, what that means is that our understanding of recovery is based in large part on what your heart rate and what your cardiovascular system is doing. And so in that case, while it is phenomenal, it is absolutely a step in the right direction and a great step in the right direction that folks are now paying attention to the way that they sleep. Folks are now paying attention to the way that they should recover. We have to question whether or not what we're getting is complete or if it biases towards the metabolic at the expense of the psychological, the mechanical, and the neural. Because when we go and look at this, right, what that then does is that puts us in a position where we aren't necessarily able to best meet the demand of how to go and actually respond to stress. Because the way that we see functional state is going to be biased towards your metabolic system. And so that is going to be more of a shotgun, sort of cast a wide net approach to recovery and readiness. And so what that then leaves us, the position that then leaves us in is a situation where we need to cast a wide net with our recovery strategies. And that's really sort of where we are, right? The current status of our regen, and we saw it in those slides from the regen lecture, from the XPS or our phase 1 performance mentorship, are based on having regen built into the day, built into the training week, built into the month and built into the annual calendar. Where in the training day and the training week, really those regen activities follow a pretty set structure and a pretty set schedule. On a at the end of a training session, we might go through some soft tissue or mobility type work specific to the parts of your body that would have been trained on the day, right? So for a upper body push, lower body pull, we might be targeting your pecs, we might be targeting your glutes, your hamstrings, your calves. Whereas for a lower body push, upper body pull type day, we might then be looking at your lats. We might also be looking at your glutes, your quads, maybe your adductors as well, right? And so in that regen specific day, we're looking at targeting our soft tissue and our mobility practice to the parts of the body, so to speak, that were really worked and absorb that stimulus through that training session. Then on a regen day, a day where we have dedicated strategies to focus on your ability to recover, we come in, we have 20, 30 minutes of active rest, thinking about non-weight bearing, low level, meaning yellow zone, ESD training, just to kind of get some blood flowing, get a bit of a metabolic sort of flush happening throughout the system, stimulate a bit of lymphatic drainage to get any of that dead, gross tissue out of there, and then come over with soft tissue and mobility work, maybe a little bit of activation type stuff at the end to put the pieces together to make folks feel whole. But that's sort of the regen practice at the end of a training session or on a specific regen day, at 52 weeks a year. Right? Like it is a bit of a shotgun approach. And again, you think, is that going to be the best thing for a mechanical type training session? Well, maybe if you come in and you feel quite sore, how does 20 to 30 minutes of spinning on a bike, doing some soft tissue and some stretching sound? That sounds real good. But if you come in and you're just smashed and you're just crushed because you've been sleeping poorly, because you were up late watching Ted Lasso, because you couldn't, because you got yourself a red light ticket trying to make up some time, like, is that active rest, soft tissue, mobility? Is that going to be the most appropriate stimulus, or is there a way to target the recovery to the stimulus which is applied? And so that's really sort of the crux of where all of this conversation started for us. Right? What is the current status, and is that good enough? Exos has a very strong lineage in a mindset of a no ethical stone left unturned mentality. We always want to question the things that we know, the things that we think that we know, so that we then are able to go and continue to push the envelope of what's happening. Right? And that's really where we come into section 3, which is how do we organize our recovery strategies to match the stress load, the external load that gets internalized, that's been applied. And this is really where we understand that we've got significant opportunity to be able to make upgrades. Because this is where, instead of taking this broad sort of blanket approach to to recovery, now can we think about different ways to be able to organize the training stress and the training stimulus that's applied? Because again, if we think about the different types of sessions that exist, if we think about the different types of sessions that we have, right? We have the more neural type session, we have the more mechanical type session, we have a more metabolic type session, and we have a more psychological type session or stress load that gets induced. Remember, these neural sessions are going to be sessions where you are trying to push the force velocity curve, either with heavy weights or fast speeds or combinations of the two for a very small number of reps. The mechanical, you're going to be more of a moderate load at more of a moderate volume, but you're still going to be pushing really, really hard. The metabolic is obviously where you're going to have a much lower intensity for a much longer duration. And then the psychological is the environmental, the intrapersonal as we go through here. And the idea, the fundamental premise here is that these 4 sessions are not the same. The way that these 4 sessions affect the human system, the way that these 4 examples of external load get internalized is significantly different. For example, if we think about your nervous system, if we think about a neural type demand, right, we understand that these are training sessions with heavy loads or high speeds, right? These are things that are going to challenge the ability of your nervous system to be able to organize the response to action. Yes, it's going to be taxing on the mechanical system, the soft tissues that are involved, but the primary demand is going to be placed on the ability of the nervous system to recruit progressively deeper and deeper into pools of motor units to exert the right force within the right time frame. So we're thinking lifting 85% of 1 rep max plus, right? It could be targeting max power. Sessions in the gym where you're thinking about genuinely pushing the force velocity curve, living and understanding that every point on the force velocity curve is maximal intensity. It's simply just different combinations of how much weight you're lifting and how quickly you're moving it. To that extent, we think about velocity-based training, right? This sort of, I guess it's not new really anymore, but this sort of updated approach to targeting the application of load in the gym. And we think about velocity-based training sessions with working sets of less than 5 reps. Because remember, what's baked into the idea of a velocity-based training session is that because you are trying to move the bar as fast as possible with every rep on every set, right, you are always sort of dancing right up on that force velocity curve. And so when we're looking at velocity-based training sessions where we are programming less than 5 reps, what that means is we are targeting a genuine neuromuscular, a genuine nervous type response or stress load. We think also about max speed sprints. Again, very short duration, very high intensity, lots of rest here, right? And so we think about the type of recovery strategies that we have, and we reference back to the active strategies, to the passive strategies laid out at the top of this webinar. Where the passive strategies, remember, we had sleep, we had nutrition strategies, and we had psychological unload. The active, we talked about soft tissue or self-massage, we talked about stretching, we talked about hydrotherapy, and we talked about active rest. And we think if you've gone through a very neurally taxing session, that external load gets internalized as a neural stress load, right? You think about what the best thing to do in that case is, right? Go ahead and jump in the cold tub, right? Cold tub for us here at the facility in Phoenix, Arizona is 51 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 11 degrees Celsius. Go in there for 5 to 10, maybe even 15 minutes up to the waist. Go in there and start to try to reestablish, try to diminish the activity of sympathetic nervous system. Give your nervous system the ability to down regulate. Put yourself in a position where nervous system then is going to be able to relax, to catch a bit of recovery by stimulating parasympathetic nervous system, by de-emphasizing sympathetic nervous system activity. And to that end, let's think about getting some static stretching, right? Static stretching, we understand, has been vilified in our industry because of the reduction in power output after a regime of static stretching. But understanding that there's no such thing as a bad exercise, there's just bad programming, it doesn't make sense to put static stretching at the top of a training session. Hey guys, we're gonna really push your deadlift today. We're gonna think about getting down to some heavy singles, right? We want to think about being 97% of 1 rep max greater. In anticipation of this training session, guys, we're gonna do some static stretching on your hamstrings, right? Like that probably doesn't make sense. But how about after that training session? During that training session, you get so spun up, you get so active. In general adaptation syndrome, Dr. Sellier would call that the response, right? You have responded appropriately to that stimulus. But once that stimulus is removed, and this is the heart of what recovery is, once that stimulus is removed, the response should also go away. But when we are in a situation where we move from one stress load to another stress load to another stress load because you have training and then you have traffic and then you have home and family and work life, that stimulus effectively never gets removed. And so we are always responding. And so having these recovery strategies at a very fundamental level is incredibly important because it gives us opportunity to be able to adapt. It gives us opportunity to be able to respond to that stimulus, to respond to that stress load to improve functional state. But just because you have one type of stress load doesn't mean that all types of recovery strategies are going to be just as effective. And so here, if you're in a session which is more neurally demanding, understanding, of course, that these are going to be high intensity sessions with low volume and lots of rest, that there's going to be, primarily this will show up as a neural stress load, but it also would show up as a mechanical, wouldn't it? Right? We would want to then focus our recovery strategies on things which are going to support the nervous system's ability to respond. And based on those categories of active and passive and the strategies which were provided at the top of this presentation, we think about, let's get you in a cold tub for some hydrotherapy. Let's get some static stretching done, not active, static stretching. Sit and hold. Do it while you're watching TV. That's phenomenal, right? We want to think about nutrition strategies to manage systemic inflammation, right? To improve the ability of nervous system to myelinate in response, to improve the replenishment of sodium potassium pumps, these sorts of things along the body of the axons, right? Let's think about, and this is the big one, right? This is going to show up everywhere. Let's think about your ability to sleep. Let's get you on a more consistent schedule. Let's get you in a dark, quiet, cold room. Let's remove unnecessary environmental obstacles to your ability to get into sleep and to get good quality sleep. So for a neural type stimulus, these are some samples of things that we would want to focus on. Then when we look at mechanical, remember mechanical is a training session with moderate to heavy loads with moderate amounts of rest, right? You're lifting some weight, you're lifting some volume, you have some rest, right? It sounds a bit easier than it actually is, because if you've ever been in a 6x6 at 80 to 82 or 83% of 1 rep max on 2 minutes of rest, that's not an easy session, especially you come up on rep 33, 34, 35, 36, like that is a grind. But remember, mechanical stress loads are stress loads that are going to stress basically the soft tissues of the body, the muscles, the tendons, the ligaments, these sorts of things. These are sessions which are generally just going to make you feel sore, right? You're going to wake up the next day and you're going to feel a little bit creaky, right? It's going to take a little bit to sort of get yourself going and shake some of that off. So you think mechanically focused hypertrophy sessions, right? Here's another example: 5 sets of 5 at 83% of one with 2 minutes of rest. Another incredibly challenging training session. Think about eccentrically focused strength sessions. Maybe you are tempo controlling your work so that in your 5x5 at 83, it wouldn't be 83. In your lifting, you might give a 3-2-1 tempo where it's a 3-second eccentric, 2-second pause, 1 second to return back up to the top, right? Through the concentric phase, right? And in that 3-2-1 tempo training session, you're biasing the eccentric phase. You're going to increase the damage that's done to the tissue, right? And so you're going to increase the soreness, but also the hypertrophy that comes out of that training session. Super great strategy to improve hypertrophy in basic movements, right? To tempo control. But that's going to be a really heavy mechanical stimulus. And it could be 5x5 at 83, but it could be 3-2-1. It could be a 3-2-1 tempo at a much lower weight for a much quote unquote softer set and rep scheme. Right? You think about deceleration focused movement skills. Maybe it's multi-directional that you're focusing on. Maybe it's going from acceleration to deceleration, right? Where you're really trying to stop on a dime. That eccentric load, again, is what's going to stimulate the soreness. And that soreness is really going to be indicative that session was really taxing on the mechanical system. Now, if you have a eccentrically focused session, if you have a mechanical type session, does that mean that there's not also a neural stress load or a metabolic stress load? No, of course not. We understand that training sessions are going to show up as a blend of 2 or maybe even 3 of these categories of stress load, not to mention the psychological aspect as well. But it is to say that some training sessions are going to bias more towards neural sessions, mechanical sessions, metabolic sessions, and psychological type sessions or psychological type stress loads as well. And so understanding in a mechanical type session, again, you come in and you just feel really sore. What sounds good, right? Like what feels right? Well, again, thinking back to those active and passive strategies we called out before at the top of the presentation, let's get some soft tissue done, right? Let's get some static or dynamic flexibility work, because just moving is going to help you to sort of break up some of that very localized swelling that might be inducing some of that pain and the soreness. A new strategy here that we talk a little bit about online in the XPS is compression, right? Get yourself into some compression boots to go and squeeze effectively, very similar to having a massage done, but get that compression to stimulate blood flow back to the heart, stimulate some lymphatic drainage to bring out all that necrotic tissue from the training session, and get a bit of recovery here. And then think about nutrition, where before it was nutrition to manage inflammation. Now let's think about nutrition to support muscle protein synthesis, nutrition to support an anabolic process. Right? What is your carbohydrate protein ratio in your post-workout training shape? Right? Are you best able to replenish glycogen stores, understanding that then also is going to improve the ability of protein to come into the muscle and help to rebuild from the damage which has been done. And of course, here as well, let's get you sleep. Right? We understand deep sleep. Body has in deep sleep, brain has the opportunity to be able to restore the body. REM sleep, brain has opportunity to restore more of itself, and it's not quite that cut and dry, but it is. It can break down sort of along those lines of what are things that we can do to optimize your ability to get into a deep level, into a deep stage of sleep. And so, for a mechanical type training session, these are the strategies that we might employ. For a mechanical type stress load, these are the things that we might target. Somebody comes in, coach, I feel really sore today. Here's your tool belt. Let's get some soft tissue. Let's get some static or dynamic flexibility work, either on a dedicated regen day, static, or in anticipation of another training session, dynamic. Let's get some compression. Let's think about nutrition. Let's get you some sleep. In a metabolic stimulus then, from a metabolic stress load, remember, these are training sessions with higher volumes or longer durations, or both in some cases, right? These are sessions which are primarily going to tax your cardiovascular system. So we think about metabolically focused hypertrophy sessions, 3 sets of 12 at maybe 60% of 1 rep max. You think about the difference of that 3 sets of 12 versus 6 sets of 6, right? 3 by 12, you get 36 working reps. 6 by 6, you get 36 working reps. But those are very different 36 reps, aren't they? Right? So you think in this case about that 3 by 12, you think moderate to longer duration ESD, things that generally are going to go and target your cardiovascular system. You go and you ride your bike to the next town and you come back for 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours. You go and you hike around in the mountains and in the desert for 2 or 3 days, right? Like you have you have these cardiovascular type stimuli, and what feels good there, right? Is a cold tub going to be helpful? Yes. Is active and passive, active and or static stretching going to be effective? Yes. But are there things that we can do to primarily target the metabolic stress load and the metabolic functional state and improve that so that you then are able to perform at a higher level later on? And here we think strategies would be compression again, right? The way that compression again is going to move blood flow back towards the heart. We think about ways that compression is going to stimulate that lymphatic drainage. Super helpful when you've gone and you've been on your legs for an extended period of time. We think also here, active rest from the list that we provided at the top of the presentation is going to be really helpful here. Think about that low level yellow zone work, right? Yellow zone meaning low intensity. Thinking even in the lower part of the yellow zone, right? Like just get on and kind of move and flush. But bonus points if you can have these 2 asterisks, right? You have your low level yellow zone work that is concentrically focused, meaning there's no eccentric stimulus, right? Running has a significant eccentric stimulus every time that your foot contacts the ground, for example, right? Weightlifting has a significant eccentric stimulus every time you control the load down towards the ground, right? And so can we focus on movements which are concentrically focused? Riding a bike fits into this category, being on an elliptical fits into this category, sitting on a rowing ergometer or a ski ergometer fits into this category, pushing a sled fits into this category, crawling fits into this category, right? So can we be concentrically focused, but can we also be non-weight bearing, right? Sitting on a bike, being on an elliptical, two phenomenal options here. 20 to 30 minutes. Let's get that little bit of a flush, right? Just to stimulate a bit of bringing in some good nourishment from cardiovascular system, and then taking away some of the damaged metabolic byproduct, these sorts of things. And then here again, nutrition to manage systemic inflammation, right? What is nutrition to support your ability to go and do work for longer periods of time? And of course here, sleep, right? Sleep being the catch-all, the silver bullet when it comes to recovery. Hands down, if somebody comes in and they're showing signs of either being overtrained or under-recovered, the first place that we go is to look at how they're at what their sleep is. Are you getting a consistent block of time, number of hours? Are you getting a consistent schedule, bedtime, wake time, 7 days a week, right? The first place that we're going to go. We look at consistency. We look at having dark, quiet, cold rooms. We look at managing environmental factors like alcohol and caffeine intake and these sorts of things. But sleep is by and large the very first place that we're going to go. And so for a mechanical type session, here are things, or for a mechanical type stress load, we can target the ability to respond to that with compression, concentrically focused, non-weight bearing, yellow zone, ESD sessions, nutrition to manage inflammation, and sleep. And then of course, we think about psychological stress load. And this would be stress load in the inter or intrapersonal sphere, right? Interpersonal, how I deal with others. Intrapersonal, how I deal with myself. So how you feel, how you respond to environmental stressors which are placed upon you, right? You get that red light camera speeding through, trying to make up some time. How does that affect you, right? and this is based a lot on your ability to be self-aware that a stimulus has been applied and that you have and that you are responding, right? And so how well are you able to wedge apart the application of the stimulus and the execution of the response? There was a psychologist, Viktor Frankl, who said that between stimulus and response is a moment, and in that moment is opportunity to make a decision, and in that decision is the power to live our lives to the best ability that we can. And I'm paraphrasing there because I haven't got it directly in front of me, but the idea is that you get that red light camera. You can choose what your response is if you have the internal awareness and the tools to be able to regulate yourself, right? So you think about psychological stressors, psychological stress loads. It might be first day with a new team, right? The jitters that you feel getting out to the field for the first time. It could be that you're having persistent underperformance. You're not able to hit your weights. You're not able to hit your times. If you're in sport, you keep getting burned by a player on the opposite team. It could be that things generally just are not going right. And so in this case, right, we think about different types of things that we can do to improve your internal awareness and to give you tools to self-regulate. So what are specific breathwork practices that we can do? What are some meditation type things that we can do? Let's get you into the cold tub here. And here it's not about a sympathetic or parasympathetic balance. Here it's about inoculating you to stress. Deliberately choosing to put yourself in a stressful situation so that you have the opportunity to practice responding to stress, which is a wild concept. We're going to dive into that in part 2. You think about nutrition to support cognitive performance, right? What sort of things can we do to improve the ability of brain to process, right? To improve the likelihood that you're going to make a good decision. And of course here, sleep being the thing, sleep being the one. Right? And so across neural, mechanical, metabolic, and psychological, hopefully we understand that these are different types of stress loads that exist. Hopefully we understand that not all stress shows up in the body in the same way. Hopefully we have a bit of a taste of what to do in the face of a more neural, more mechanical, more metabolic, or more psychologically based stimulus and stress that's been applied to your clients, to your members, to your athletes. And so now the question is this: take a look at your programming and think through what the stress load is that you're providing. Right? Is it biased more towards one versus the other? Maybe it's more mechanical than metabolic. Maybe it's more metabolic than neural. And should there be a balance? Right? Think not only about the type of stress that you're providing, but what sort of recovery strategies do you offer? Right? Is there opportunity to program, to periodize your recovery strategies in the exact same way that we program and we periodize our training programs, our training plans? If we progressively are changing the stimulus that we're applying, then shouldn't we also be progressively changing the strategies that we employ to recover from that stimulus? Taking into consideration that a psychological stress is not going to show up in the body in the same way that a neural stress would, or a mechanical or a metabolic for that matter. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I've certainly enjoyed taking these concepts out for a bit of a walk and giving them a bit of air. It's been really great fun for me. And you remember from the top of the presentation, this was part one, right? We've got 3 more parts coming up where I'm going to jump on with Dr. Chris Bertram in part 2, and we're going to talk about, as a PhD in applied neuroscience, we're going to talk about recovery from his perspective and what does that look like from the way that he sees the world. I'm going to get on part 3 with Shannon Earhart, CSSD, registered dietitian here in Phoenix, Arizona, with me as well. And we're going to talk about what does recovery look like from a nutrition perspective in part 3. And then in part 4, getting on with Omi Iwasaki, the one and the only, to talk through what does recovery look like from his perspective as a physical therapist, as a doctor of physical therapy. And so I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope that you found some. I hope that you found some good information here. And I guess we'll see you guys in just a bit.